So, hi everyone. Welcome to our February Nature Talks. This talk is about wetlands, specifically gaps in wetlands conservation in Nova Scotia. This is our monthly talks, and we do this on the first Tuesdays of every month with a rotating team. And this month is Wetland Month. We are so lucky tonight to be joined by a true naturalist, Becky Parker, Nature Nova Scotia coordinator. Becky has a BSc and a master degree of applied science, and she is going to be talking to us about some wetlands basic and some of the conservation gaps in wetlands here in Nova Scotia. So folks, if you have any questions, please send it in the chat and Becky and I will try our best to answer your questions. We will be meeting everyone so there's no disruption during the presentation. That said, if you're new here, folks, I will make sure there's some information about Nature Nova Scotia and how you can get involved more with Nature Talks later on. I am so excited for this presentation tonight because wetlands are a very important ecosystem and they need to be protected. Looking forward to learning more about wetlands tonight, folks. So Becky, why don't you tell us a little bit about yourself and how you got to Nature Nova Scotia, and we can go right into your presentation.
Yeah, thanks, Unity. You got me excited about my own presentation there. Yeah, well, for folks who don't know me, I'm Becky Parker. Been working in and around conservation in Nova Scotia and a few other places for a while, and found my way to Nature Nova Scotia originally as a board member through the Young Naturalist Club, who I also work with. So yeah, I'm just really keen on getting folks out into nature and learning about natural history here, and yeah, that's what I'm doing. A lot of my work has focused on wetlands, and so when we had to fill a gap in this month's presentation, that just seemed like a good fit, and I'm happy to be here talking about wetlands. It's also timely because World Wetlands Day is tomorrow, and we have some explainer series and fun stuff coming out for that day to celebrate wetlands. So, I mean, what I'm talking about tonight, I suppose, is really just a high level look at some things that we at Nature Nova Scotia and some partners have been discussing for the last couple weeks, and some plans we have for next World Wetlands Day. So probably the best thing to do here for me is for me to share my screen. Okay. So if you're new to wetlands, I will talk a bit about what wetlands are, where Nova Scotia's wetlands are, and how you can explore them. But I am going to talk just at a very high level about how wetlands maybe aren't as protected as we would like them to be in Nova Scotia. So Nova Scotia does have a pretty progressive wetland policy, as well as legislation and stewardship programs, either run by government or funded by government, that offer wetlands a lot of protection here compared with other jurisdictions in Canada and the States. But there are a couple gaps, and we've, I guess, become aware of these gaps through our work at Nature Nova Scotia and through discussion with some partners over the last couple weeks. We had a series of meetings with folks organized by Ecology Action Center, originally to talk about plans for World Wetlands Day, and then to talk about gaps in what we thought was maybe the wetland policy. That discussion turned into a bigger talk about different types of protections, legal protections, stewardship program protections that are currently offered in Nova Scotia, and where gaps might be as a result of those pieces not coming together or overlapping in ways that really truly protect wetlands. And so this is important to us at Nature Nova Scotia because we obviously care very much about wetlands, and for lots of reasons, not least of which because wetlands provide billions of dollars worth of goods and services for Nova Scotians every year, and I'll talk a little bit about that. They provide habitat and recreational opportunities, and they're just really important ecosystems. So at the end of this a series of meetings that we had with smart wetland folks over the last little while, we agreed that in the next 12 months, we would work together on this discussion paper, or something like a discussion paper that would dig deeper into these gaps and hopefully present some recommendations towards filling those. So that's the plan for next World Wetlands Day. So I'm just going to introduce some of those gaps and maybe get you guys thinking about ways that we could start filling those. So if you have any thoughts throughout this presentation, or if you have any questions about how these pieces fit together, I mean, feel free to interrupt and put your questions in the chat if you're not comfortable speaking. Yeah, would like this to be a kind of ongoing discussion more than anything else. So this is me and my friend Matt, shoulder deep in a bog in New Brunswick. We were looking for tea bags at the time as part of a decomposition study that we were volunteering on. Sadly, this site's samples all disappeared after a really rough winter popped our tags out of the ground, and then a beach cleanup went through and took them. So I don't have any cool results to share from this particular study, but I did just want to show you how large and how deep and really impressive some of these ecosystems can be. So Matt's being a bit of a wimp here, only going elbow deep, I guess, but I did manage to get my whole arm into this bog, and I never reached clay or water or rock or anything that you might reasonably expect to be at the bottom of a bog. Bogs are my favorite wetland type. I think, unfortunately, unless you work in conservation or maybe you hunt, or you're a really keen naturalist, you probably don't spend a lot of time in bogs. They smell, they're wet, and they maybe aren't appealing hiking destinations. So when I talk about wetlands and when I talk about bogs and all the reasons why they're important, I like to give people an overview of how different wetlands, how their form and function differs, and why those result in different traits, I guess, that make them so important for us. So in Nova Scotia, you're probably going to hear these 5 words when it comes to wetlands: marshes, bogs, fens, swamps, and vernal pools. But a wetland is really just anywhere that is permanently or seasonally wet. So quite literally wet land. Not a lake, but maybe the edge of the lake where you have some riparian vegetation that's shallow, kind of mucky, full of grasses and other vegetation, where there's an obvious buffer, I suppose, between a fully aquatic environment and a fully terrestrial. So in Nova Scotia, you'll probably encounter these words the most. And a marsh is just one kind of wetland that is dominated by emergent vegetation. So lots of water in these wetlands. You'll find marshes at the edges of ponds, lakes, rivers, and estuaries, maybe where a river meets a larger water body. And in Nova Scotia, we have salt marshes, which are really just salty marshes, either because they're on the ocean or they're on an estuary on the ocean. Sometimes you'll find marshes in areas behind border beaches, either an actual marsh or something that in Nova Scotia we call a Barishaw pond, which can sometimes have marsh-like vegetation, sometimes it has more bog-like vegetation. But they're super important for a lot of reasons. For wildlife habitat, migratory birds especially use marshes as stopover and breeding habitat. Large marshes on the New Brunswick border are particularly important for migratory waterfowl. And they're also breeding grounds for fish species, both freshwater and marine. And they are a super important part of our coastal natural infrastructure. So marshes with all of that emergent vegetation slow and filter moving water, trap sediment, the muck and stuff that moves through, buffering the neighboring drier areas. So marshes are really important if you live on the coast and you're concerned about climate change, because they are the thing protecting you from the worst effects of bad storm surges. This is my favorite marsh. I hope everyone can see it okay. This is Chesapeake Marsh in the Chesapeake Inlet. It's about 40 minutes outside of Halifax. It's the last large salt marsh that you can see from the 107 on the way out to Musquodoboit Harbor. And if you have driven that route in the summertime, you probably know it as the smelliest salt marsh in Nova Scotia. I don't have data to back that up, but it sounds true. The reason Chesapeake is so smelly is because it does this every day. So in these 2 images, I have high tide and low tide, or very close to low tide anyway. We don't normally get really dramatic tides on this side of the Atlantic, but the difference between high and low tide in Chesapeake is pretty extreme for that side of the province. I mean, nothing like the Bay of Fundy, of course, but still. The reason for that is actually similar to the reason the Bay of Fundy has really extreme tides, and it's because Chesapeake Inlet it's very large, but it's also very long and narrow. And so the way water comes in and comes out of there can be pretty dramatic. And when that water is out, you can see in the lower photo here, a lot of that sediment is exposed and all of the gases that are trapped within escape, and the whole area smells like a giant fart. The best. Also full, you can kind of tell in the bottom photo there a little bit better, it's also full of islands and shallow areas where that marsh vegetation is able to get a hold and trap that sediment. So for twice a day, comes in, goes out, gases are released, it's real stinky. It's a great paddle, if a bit tricky because of the currents in the inlet, but I do highly recommend exploring that marsh. And this is the road behind Queensland Beach after Hurricane No, I think, most recent hurricane. This wasn't the first storm to damage this road. This happens pretty regularly at Queensland Beach. The narrow divide that this road sits on between the beach and the brackish or kind of salty lake behind is largely man-made, and it's very exposed. Going back to Eastern Shore area, this is the beach at the end of East Chesapeake. Also has, or lower East Chesapeake, I should say, also has a brackish lake behind it and a shallow cobble berm. Several times in the last couple of decades, this cobble beach has broken, sometimes more seriously than others, and it makes the lake behind it become quite a bit saltier, which is, though definitely a normal coastal process, maybe becoming more common under climate change, also probably inconvenient, if not dangerous, for the folks who live on the lakes on the other side. So neither of these areas are protected by salt marshes. They're both right on the coast. Here's Queensland Beach, and it's lake above, and then lower East Chesapeake below. Both right on the coast where real estate is at a prime and the ocean has no sympathy. So personally, if I were shopping for ocean views, these right on the coast areas is not where I'd be heading. I would be heading back towards East Chesapeake, up by, I guess you can see it on this map here, where lower East Chesapeake turns, you can go to Conrod's Beach. And there's shelter in the inlet from eelgrass, and as you can probably tell from this image, some nice salt marshes. And where uncoincidentally, there was less damage after the storms that broke those two barrier beaches. Peatlands. So peatlands, like bogs, fens, swamps, and wetlands made up of a combination of these wetland types, they all have sphagnum moss, or what you might know as peat. So bogs are areas where, because of poor draining soil, maybe they're positioned in the landscape, they've accumulated layers of peat, and that peat substrate builds on top of itself and then supports other vegetation like grasses and shrubs and other wet adapted plants, and becomes this kind of floating mass on either water or on a squishy landscape. Sphagnum moss tends to build on itself because it's really slow to decompose, which is kind of a feature of the moss itself and also a feature of the environment that it lives in. Peatlands, bogs especially, tend to be really wet and acidic, which makes decomposition really slow. And so that's why you get that kind of building action where the bottom layer is this kind of like partially decomposed yellowish brownish peat mass, and the top is living moss, which is a pretty cool system. Some really massive bogs, like those you find in southwest Nova Scotia, actually sit a little bit above the rest of the landscape, even though they're full of water, which is why I say bogs are like sponges. They're quite literally these water holding squishy things sitting on the landscape. Some bogs have open water, and you can see in this photo, there's just a little bit of water visible at the very bottom. You might notice a ring of black spruce or other wet adapted trees at the edge of bogs, maybe even some within drier areas in the bog itself. Most bogs tend to fill themselves in over time as that floating mass of moss and other plants extends into the water. So if there is open water, it tends to get kind of filled up over time as that sponge moves towards itself. I really love walking through bogs. I know that these aren't the most appealing wetland if you're new to them, But a bog with an open center, I think, is probably the coolest place where you can take a walk and go see cool plants for sure. But also because it's just a really cool experiment to walk out to the edge of that sponge and take just a little bit of a hop, because you can feel the floating mass move. It's a really kind of surreal experience being on land, but also not really on land. Do be careful if you're exploring a bog. If I have managed to encourage you to go out, because that's a good area to lose a boot in or leg. Here you can see some of that variety that I was talking about. So in the foreground, we have some stunted, I think Rosa rugosa, perhaps, which would make sense because this was behind a beach. And then lots of grasses and sedges in the middle. You can see these little white heads of cotton grass, and then you can definitely see these purple brown tops of carnivorous pitcher plants. There's also some drier areas in the middle of the bog where you can see some taller shrubs are growing. And at the very back, you can see there's those small stunted and club form black spruce. So really typical bog formation right here. This is a raised bog near Port Latour on the South Shore. I was there in August with some young naturalist club families learning about transect surveys, which is what we're doing here. This wetland is massive. We were really close to the tree line here. So if I probably should have showed a photo from the other side. If I turned around, I wouldn't be able to see the tree line quite as well because this was a massive bog. Just a really great example of that classic Southwest Nova Scotia raised bog system. So a lot of the same plants here, but also a really cool plant that is not in a lot of other bogs, which is the endangered threadleaf sundew, another reason we went out to that bog. Super cool, but also really tiny carnivorous plant, only found in a handful of bogs in Southwest Nova Scotia. I think the next nearest population is maybe in New Jersey, if I'm remembering correctly, the New England area anyway. I could go on about bogs for a long time. They're so cool. Fens. Fens are another kind of wetland. You could call them a peatland that we have in Nova Scotia. Fens can be kind of like bogs, but they have running water. So they have water moving through them, whereas bogs might have just that kind of sitting open water or no open water at all. Bogs get their water almost entirely through precipitation. So water falls in the landscape, collects in the bog, and it's just there in that sponge. Whereas fens have that water course, so they could be fed their water through a couple of different avenues. And for that reason, fens might be less acidic than a bog, and they could contain more marsh-like vegetation. This is almost more like a ditch that you might see at the side of any road in this fen here, because there's a lot of marsh vegetation. We actually have what you might call alkaline fens in Nova Scotia, which are super cool. In those fens, the water chemistry, for one reason or another, is not only less acidic, but has tipped on over to the other side of the pH scale. And they contain a really cool variety of unusual plants that are adapted to that environment in the same way that acidic-loving plants are adapted to bogs. In Cape Breton, there is an alkaline fen, which maybe some of our supporters have been to, with hoary willow, which is a pretty cool and unusual plant for us. Bogs and fens could occur together. I mean, they often do as part of a larger wetland complex. So you could be likely to find both if you're in the interior of the province, maybe at the headwaters of major watersheds, or in the case of a bog, maybe you're at the top of a, a table mountain in Cape Breton. That's a good place to find bogs as well. Swamps are similarly peaty with trees, sometimes shrubs, but they have to have at least 30% tree or shrub cover. So in Nova Scotia, we consider a peatland to be a swamp if it has over that 30%, but it could have quite a bit more. Shrub swamps with lots of alder, willows, and other short trees tend to turn into treed swamps over time, assuming you don't have any kind of dramatic change in the local hydrology. In this swamp, you can see that there's a lot of bog-like vegetation, and it's kind of located in this opening in the surrounding forest. I see some fallen trees here. I think I see some spruce, maybe some tamarack in the back. lots of fallen, drowned trees, which is not uncommon, especially if the hydrology has changed relatively recently. Maybe it's become wetter over time. But subswamps have large mature trees. So another wetland type you might hear about in Nova Scotia is a floodplain. These are swamps, usually at the edges of lakes or rivers that are just periodically flooded. So in this swamp that I have in our photo here, you can see a lot of coniferous trees for sure, black spruce, but in a floodplain, you might see something more like red maple, which is also wet tolerant, but more of a floodplain species. Black ash might be found in small swamps that are kind of nestled between drier forest types. All those types can be easy to miss though, if it's the drier part of the year and you don't know what you're looking for. So if you dug a hole in this forest, I suspect you would see that telltale bluish gray soil profile, maybe even some signs of iron or clay. But just walking through in the summer or winter when the ground is frozen, this might just look like any other forest. But swamps provide important habitat for a lot of native wildlife. So swamps like this one in our photo are breeding habitat for migratory birds that prefer edge habitats. So like our endangered Canada warbler likes to be kind of on the edge or transition area of two forest types. If they contain open water, they could support insects, amphibians, and the predators that depend on them. And like our other wetlands, from a landscape perspective, like our marshes, swamps act as a buffer for neighboring forests by sucking up this extra water. And like peatlands, they sequester carbon with that slow decomposing sphagnum moss and living trees. So really important ecosystems. Lastly, our vernal pools. So these are temporary wetlands, usually found in a forest or even within a swamp, that form in these shallow pits, I guess I would say. You might find them in a depression left by maybe a tree that's fallen over a long time ago, or you just might find them within a larger swamp complex in the lower areas where the water can accumulate. And they're really important habitat for forest-dwelling species that need water as part of their life cycle. So our frogs, salamanders, turtles. If you're from the Annapolis Valley, you might recognize the fairy shrimp that I stuck in this slide here. These are these really strange googly-eyed invertebrates that are only known from a few vernal pools in the valley. And I think maybe one location on the North Shore now. I'm sure someone will correct me if I'm wrong. But vernal pools, because of their nature, are definitely the wetland type that we know the least about. They're small, we don't know exactly where they are, how they're connected to the surrounding landscape, or what other kinds of weird plants and other things might live in them. So I've included a link here because the province is looking for help identifying these wetlands. So if you're interested in vernal pools, if you happen to be out exploring, or if you think you have one on your property, definitely check out the link and tell the province you've got one. All right, so we've went over what wetlands are. Where are Nova Scotia's wetlands? So they're kind of everywhere. Large salt marshes, you're going to want to look to the Bay of Fundy, the North Shore, New Brunswick border. And to a lesser degree, there are some large salt marshes on the south and eastern shores around Halifax, and some more so towards the South Shore. Barishwell ponds you can find pretty well along the Atlantic coast, or any of our coasts. They're particularly common on the Atlantic coast. Anywhere that has one of those barrier beaches, like I showed, look behind those, you might find one. Peatlands can be found throughout the province too, especially in the interior and at the edges of other wetland types, even on the coast. And for freshwater marshes, of course, you're going to want to look to the lake shores and other riparian areas. So unfortunately, as much as there's a lot that we don't know about wetlands, we do know that we've lost at least 50% of our historic salt marshes and up to 80% of salt marshes on the Bay of Fundy, mostly to diking for agricultural land post-European settlement. We don't know how many or what coverage of freshwater wetlands has been lost, but it's estimated that just salt marshes give us $400 million in ecosystem services each year, and all of our wetlands, $7.9 billion in things like saved water quality control, flood mitigation, infrastructure repair costs, wildlife habitat, and more. So if wetlands didn't have their own intrinsic value before, I hope that this and my earlier slides have convinced you that they do have some serious economic value. Most of our wetlands are peatlands, so our bogs, fens, peaty swamps. Our rarest wetlands are the freshwater marshes and floodplain swamps. Forested swamps are a bit tricky. They're almost certainly underestimated in Nova Scotia's wetland inventory, which we have and was created in 2004. They're difficult to detect through remote sensing technology, and they can be small, which makes them hard to find. They probably also go underreported, either by landowners or visitors to areas where they exist who just don't know what they're looking at. So it's probably safe to assume that we have or had a lot of forested swamps in Nova Scotia as well. All right, how are wetlands protected? So Nova Scotia has had a wetland policy since 2011. Its goal is to prevent the net loss of wetlands in Nova Scotia. And so under the wetland policy and the Related Environment Act, some wetlands are protected from all kinds of development through designation as what's called a wetland of special significance. So for example, salt marshes are almost all protected from any kind of development, but so are wetlands within protected areas and some wetlands that are known to contain significant or special species. That's one way that the wetland policy protects wetlands in a kind of direct and immediate way, but it also spells out ways that we go about development in and around wetlands. So the Environment Act is what really defines what wetlands are in Nova Scotia and sets out regulations for their alteration and approval for development. There are specific conditions under which development in a wetland can occur. Sometimes an environmental assessment is required, sometimes compensation is required in the creation of a new and bigger wetland. Wetlands also receive some protection under the Off-Highway Vehicles Act, which attempts to prevent ATV use in sensitive wetland soils. And they also have some protection through the Forest Act, though this is kind of complicated and a bit more case by case. Working forests have to abide by these special management practices, which include for things like water courses. And in just one example, in wetlands with open water, get some protection through the use of a mandatory buffer that has to be left between a forest harvest and the water feature. So in this example, you can see where a buffer has been left between a clear cut and what looks like maybe a lake with possibly a fen or something similar and its associated wetland habitats. Here's an example of how wetlands are legally protected on working lands using a very simplified version of my own family's woodlot. So on our property, there isn't much protecting the wetlands themselves, in part because we don't have any salt marshes, which would automatically be protected as wetlands of special significance. There are some, I guess, some ways around that in like farmland, but in a woodlot, not really applicable. There are, though, specific circumstances where wetlands are either indirectly protected because of another regulated feature, or they just happen to get protection because they host a feature. So as an example, even though the floodplain forest at the bottom, or maybe I should say low end, sea level end, which is at the top of this map, of my woodlot isn't protected, and therefore I can do pretty much whatever I want in it, the water course that runs through it does give the floodplain some protection through the requirement of a buffer. And it's a little bit complex, but essentially I can only harvest a certain amount of basal area within that buffer, depending on the slope of the course of the water course's embankment. So 20 to 60 meters, depending on the area. So basically I can't clear cut it, which is good. I don't know who would clear cut a diverse floodplain forest when you could manage it for rare hardwoods, but I think it's good that I can't. I also need a permit for stream crossings, so I couldn't degrade the riparian edges of that water course. Like I couldn't impact the immediate floodplain forest next to the water course. And another example, rare lichens on my woodlot are protected by a lichen-specific special management practice. that requires that I leave 200 meters no harvest buffer and a 500-meter limited harvest buffer around that specific lichen occurrence. Because the lichen is growing in a swamp, this effectively protects that very small swamp. I should also point out lichens in this one example, in lichens in this swamp, protecting them really depends on the landowner wanting to be a good steward, because this one lichen occurrence, I mean, no one would know. We just happen to know. Now, interestingly, there is one example within this working landscape where a wetland gets protection simply because a certain species could be present if we were in Cape Breton. And that's in the lynx special management practice, which requires I leave a 100-meter buffer from the bog at the top of this woodlot. And that's because the areas immediately surrounding the bog are prime red squirrel habitat, which are a secondary source of food for lynx. So this is only applicable in certain areas of Cape Breton where the lynx special management practice is in effect. But it's interesting to me because this buffer is a lot bigger than that required for something, say, like watercourses. And the kind of harvesting that we would be likely to do in that area, which would be pretty low impact, is a lot smaller than what folks can and do harvest in areas like floodplains, which are really not protected in a lot of ways. So, but I gather the special management practice for lynx was probably brought about after over-harvesting in the 70s and 80s. So anyway. Now, on our woodlot, even though we have some suitable habitat, there's no need to implement the wood turtle special management practice because wood turtles haven't been spotted, which is kind of wild. I also don't have to implement the mainland moose special management practice. I mean, on this woodlot, you definitely wouldn't because the lynx habitat and mainland moose habitat do not overlap. But say that it wasn't Cape Breton, we're back on the mainland, I wouldn't have to implement the mainland moose special management practice because this lot is outside of the existing core areas that are designated for the mainland moose. So that could be changing because there is new core habitat identified for the moose, and I'm personally really hoping the government is going to designate it and do something about that. But if there was the need to implement the mainland moose special management practice on this lot, it would make it harder for me to clear cut the entire thing. So when you have mainland moose habitat, you have to leave certain areas of mixed woods. You have to make sure moose have access to quick cover, as well as certain buffers around water bodies and wetlands. So it would give the wetlands on this property some more protection, but really indirectly, because it's really just affecting the kind of forestry that you do. So I know that that was a whole lot of information, but I hope that it demonstrates how piecemeal wetland protection can be in these working landscapes, which make up a really huge proportion of our province, including Crown lands, and how important it is that landowners and Crown land leaseholders know about these things and want to protect them or are incentivized to protect them, because there's a lot of different pieces that have to come together here to protect wetlands. So there is federal legislation that protects some wetlands as well. The Migratory Birds Convention Act contains regulations to protect migratory birds, their eggs, and their nests from harvest. And the related North American Waterfowl Management Plan sets goals for specific species. So this is where a lot of the habitat-based conservation that you hear about comes from in Canada. It's no coincidence that our ducks and geese are doing so much better than a lot of other migratory birds. If you aren't a hunter, if you don't work in conservation, you might not know about the stamp programs that are available to you, but they're definitely important to know about. At the federal level, with your federal hunting license, you get your Canadian stamp, and then provincially, you can get another stamp with your provincial license. And these funds from the hunting licenses go into provincial pots that fund conservation projects. So research, restoration work, educational programs, but also habitat acquisition, so buying land to conserve. Excuse me, which is exactly what happened here on the Musquodoboit River when the Nature Conservancy was able to protect a piece of it. So I really like programs like the Conservation Stamp Program because they recognize that there's this, I guess, relationship between the people and the wetlands and the species that are living there, and a kind of reciprocity there. I like how it, I don't know, connects people to the land in a really meaningful way and encourages them to be good stewards. Sarpal is another example of a habitat or landscape-based incentive program in Nova Scotia, where public funds directly support wetland conservation. So this program and those related to it, like the wood turtle strides, gave agricultural landowners help to create or protect wetlands and their associated upland habitat to protect species like wood turtles. Sometimes with really simple solutions too, like fences or no mow buffers. I think that this project has wrapped up for now. Maybe someone knows more. But they were providing landowners with educational resources as well about the species they were targeting and other ways they could take action to protect them. So I really like these approaches to conservation a lot more than regulatory approaches. Not that we don't need regulation, we do. But it just makes the landowner more of a partner, I suppose, in conservation rather than a barrier to it. So if I went back to woodlands for a second, something like this that doesn't really exist, but maybe could, to bring woodlot and woodland owners more into this partnership that the province has done really well on in agricultural lands, is any sort of incentive that would encourage uneven forest management. So things that prevent clear cutting, which obviously impact the small wetlands on forested lands, whether it's investing in maple syrup or getting people to explore specialty hardwood markets or mushrooms or whatever it is. A provincial program that targeted forest landowners could go a long way towards protecting forested wetlands. I kind of got into some gaps already, but let's go over some more in a bit more detail. So firstly, the wetland conservation policy. This is what gives wetlands legal protection in Nova Scotia, but only with the Environment Act. So the Environment Act is really the legal teeth of the policy. Or as I showed, there's some other regulations of other legislation as well. The wetland policy, though, is really accessory to that legislation. So anything that's ever new and maybe really great in the wetland policy isn't necessarily safe from sudden change, and government can't be held as accountable for a policy in the same way that it can for legislation. So for example, in the wetland conservation policy, there's a demand that the government will use the encouragement of buffers to protect wetlands. But in many cases, buffers are not legally required for development, say. So the requirement that government encourage buffers is a bit loosey-goosey. We also know that the current wetland inventory is likely out of date and needs some work, which limits government's ability to assess development applications when they come in. And we know that small and temporary wetlands receive almost no protection because they don't prompt an approval process when a development project does show up. Of course, those wetlands are where we see some of our greatest biodiversity. There's also the issue of compensation for approved development in and around wetlands. Wetland restoration, especially in a salt marsh, could offset some of the lost ecosystem services of a developed wetland, but two wetlands are really hard to compare, and it might be reasonable to demand more clarity or specific rules around when government can and can't approve compensation. Approvals aren't required for forest harvest, which depending on the kind of forestry can be very comparable to a suburban development. If you're doing something like cutting firewood or opening up a very small piece of a well-managed, healthy, mature forest, maybe that's not something that requires that approval. But a clear cut or a shelter wood cut on a large scale, maybe that should be. And then there's those buffers. So government can encourage a buffer or even mandate one in a development approval, say for a new housing development, but there isn't much legal weight to requiring that buffer or what that buffer should be. So we're really depending on the expertise of staff and adherence to best practice, which I'm sure is happening within staff, but there's also the the political environment to consider. Housing is really important, and government may get pushback from developers and people supporting them to approve projects quickly and with few conditions. Even if it's bad for all of us. So we've been talking about a Coastal Protection Act in Nova Scotia for a long time, and I really hope that when it comes to this, it's going to help. But currently, that lack of a buffer requirement is putting our coasts in particular at serious risk of flooding and erosion. So this home was built in just the last couple years. I don't think it sold for $750,000, but it did sell for a lot, and right on the edge of a salt marsh. I drove by the construction site for this home often when it was going up, and I can tell you it took a lot of fill to get the ground ready. And that knowing what I know about wetlands and climate change, it wouldn't be me buying it. So this is definitely a better spot, I suppose, than those the barrier beaches that I showed earlier. This poor gentleman might not have his home flooded in the next 10 years, but it's not good. This marsh will need to recede inland as sea levels rise, and there's only one way to go. So I wouldn't be surprised if in the near future it becomes really difficult, if not impossible, for some homeowners in Nova Scotia to get insurance. So now is a really crucial time to be thinking about buffer requirements, I think, or at least that's the thing that I'm the most excited to dig into in these gaps, whether it's through provincial legislation or municipal bylaws or incentive programs or whatever. The time is now. So to sum up, I know I came down hard on the province in this presentation, but Nova Scotia does have pretty good law and policy when it comes to wetlands. We just might not be achieving our goals. So it might be time to reassess how we're going about wetland protection and if it's being successful. No net loss. I'm not convinced we know if we're achieving this, in part because of our outdated wetland inventory, but also because wetlands can be dynamic over short time spans, and the goods and services we're getting from existing wetlands we know are changing. So wetland research is only going to be more important as we move forward into climate change. Private lands are important. And if you don't have the support or partnership of people on the ground, it can be really hard to achieve conservation goals. And that failing to protect wetlands and the goods and services that they offer us will cost Nova Scotians millions or billions of dollars. We're going to be digging into some of these gaps in depth over the next year, and I'm really hoping that with the smart wetland loving people that we've been chatting with, we're going to come up with some potential solutions. But these are big topics and sometimes complex. So I encourage you in the meantime to take action for wetlands near you. And if you're interested in any of these gaps, I'm happy to have you at any of the future discussions that we're having. If you have wet areas on your property, figure out what you could be doing to be stewarding them better. You can share your love for wetlands by reaching out to your municipal councillors, your MLA. World Wetlands Day is a great time to do that. You can also nominate a wetland to be a treasured wetland of Nova Scotia. That's an educational and outreach program run by Ducks Unlimited and the province that profiles biologically and culturally significant wetlands. So I definitely recommend checking that out as well. And just learn more. There's going to be a lot of talks around World Wetlands Day and over the next couple weeks, because we also have some other days coming up. We've got an International Day of Forests or something coming up soon. So there's cool stuff going on and lots of opportunities to get involved. And I hope I've encouraged you to take a walk through a bog. Thanks for listening to me.
Thanks, Becky. So we have a question in the chat from Susan Van Etherston. She asks, if we know of a wetland that is currently under threat due to development plans, what are the best ways forward to draft preservation and protection?
Yeah, that's tricky because it depends on the wetland and what the development is and whose jurisdiction it is. So all wetlands receive some sort of protection or oversight from the province, but the municipality also plays a role in what goes forward with development. So yeah, I don't know if I can answer that without having details. I mean, I'm happy to receive emails. If you are generally concerned about future development, I mean, one thing you can do is definitely reach out to your local counselor who might know what's going on in that area.
Hi, just briefly, and I believe I've emailed you about this. I'm with a group that's currently worried about the Eisner Cove wetland in Dartmouth, which is gone through a process of once being under provincial protection, and then it moved to private holding. So all the land around it is slated for development, and it's very worrying. So I'm just wondering, we're trying really hard to do what can be done, and we can do this separately. I really appreciate some advice.
Sure. Yeah. So I don't know what stage Eisner Cove is at. Do you know if, by what stage, I mean, what approvals have been made?
The HRM City Council has approved the master planning process to go forward. Some analyses were done by the developer and submitted. The Minister of the Environment has reviewed the proposal and rejected a portion of it. There's an elevated roadway that is intended to cross directly over the wetland. And so he's requested more details about that part of the proposal. So it's sort of in the early stages, but it's moving quickly because of that pressure on housing, I think.
Yeah, I mean, I think unfortunately, often the best way to get meaningful action on issues like this is to just keep talking to people in charge, keep sending the emails, keep making phone calls. Yeah. I wish that I could give you more. I haven't been able to read about what's going on with Eisner Cove. So maybe give me some time to sort through my emails and I'll find yours.
Okay, thank you.
We have more questions in the chat. Cass Simmons says, great job, Becky. Suzanne Sidek wants to know, what is the legal definition of a wetland?
Well, that would be the Environment Act, and I think it is just exactly that. It is an area that is either permanently or seasonally wet, and the definition of wet might be something like water at or near the surface.
Yeah, Becky, that was my question. I'm kind of curious because wetlands, often the boundaries are very, very subtle, very clear. So how do you, there are ways to try to define them? I know in Fredericton, New Brunswick, a number of years ago, they did a wetland inventory, and turns out half downtown was deemed to be wetland because it floods, once in a while. So it was very controversial then. So it's how often does land have to be wet to qualify as a wetland?
Yeah, well, there's a lot of gray area in wetlands, literally, and then also from a policy perspective. So I think the question is really, when does whoever's in charge consider the wetland to be a wetland, and how are they using that information to make their decisions? And so when a professional is out doing like a wetland delineation, they're looking for signs of wet sediment, to put it really simply. But whether that information is what prompts a decision about what happens to that area, because that area might be temporarily wet when the neighboring area is clearly a marsh, what happens in that temporarily wet area might be not what it should be, if that makes sense.
Okay, yeah. Thanks. Yeah.
We have a hand up, Rebecca Parker.
Hi, Becky, it's Patricia. I came in under your name because of the link and I couldn't find my own. I can help on that answer if you want.
Great, yeah.
For wetland delineation, that's a requirement. If a developer, developers have to map the wetlands on their properties. They have to go out and identify these wet places, and they have to have a wetland delineator, certified wetland delineator, do that work. And it's the job of that person to identify the limit of the wetland, the upper boundary of it. And they use a variety of techniques to do that. You know, where's the open water, where's the water standing, but also the soil condition. And if it's, you know, a soil that's lacking in oxygen, it has a particular color and signature. Evidence of plants, water-loving plants, water-tolerant plants, you know, where the vegetation line is. And so they are able to delineate a boundary around that site, and then that site becomes the area. They calculate the area, and if they are approved for development, so they have to show why they can't develop that space, why they can't develop their property without avoiding the wetland or destroying it. They have to do everything they can to avoid it, but if they can't, then it's an assessment that they may get a permit to develop, but under that, in that case, then they would have to compensate for the loss of the function in the wetland at a ratio of 2 to 1. But that brings in the next problem: compensate how, right? Like if they're having to repair or rebuild a wetland somewhere else, it's not necessarily going to be a wetland. Usually it isn't even in the same place or nearby, and it might be a different type of wetland. So it's the ecological function that's not necessarily replaced. But that's going beyond the question. The definition for permitting is the boundary that the delineator describes.
Important thing that we haven't really incorporated into this, because wetland delineation is a standardized process in many jurisdictions. Something that isn't well incorporated into that process, or at least in practice, is the future boundaries of wetlands and how that should impact planning. So yeah, the gray area in wetlands is a problem.
Yeah, and wetland systems are not isolated systems, right? Like we see them linked along river systems and in floodplains, but we don't often consider these little micro wetlands in the landscape that together cumulatively form a system, and they may or may not be linked by flowing water. But they are linked through overland flow and animal movement and all these other things. So it becomes quite complex.
Yeah. Becky Katie in the chat says, great job. As always, Becky, summarizing a whole lot of information. What takes a whole lot of understanding? Kathy Malone has a question. She said you mentioned that the lower East Chesapeake area wasn't protected, but it is not included in the new provincial protection that was announced in the last 2 years. Does the new Biodiversity Act hold any protection for wetlands?
Yeah, so I think when it comes to your question about lower East Chesapeake Beach, I'm not sure what you mean when you say new provincial protection, like a protected areas system, or the Coastal Protection Act. I'll give you a second maybe to write that out. As for the Biodiversity Act, not really, for a couple reasons. The Biodiversity Act wasn't meant to target just wetland habitats. Specifically, the Biodiversity Act wanted to give government and landowners new tools to tackle threats to biodiversity. So what the Biodiversity Act could have done for wetlands is maybe, like, if you were dealing with an invasive species, give you more tools to fight that, or protect a new wetland or whatever. But also the Biodiversity Act really didn't make it through with any kind of weight. So not really. When it comes to the Biodiversity Act, we'll have to see what comes about in the regulations, but I'm not expecting any like major advances for wetlands specifically in that legislation. Maybe we have a lot of conservation folks here today, maybe, and somebody feels differently about that. New provincial parks. Oh, I see. Yeah, okay. So Yes, so what I mean by that area is not protected by salt marshes is that coastal developments don't have the benefit of that buffering ability of salt marshes. So that's why I say if I was shopping for, I don't know, views or oceanside property right now, and I wanted to be on that side of Halifax, I would be looking towards the inlet where I know that my shoreline is going to be relatively stable into the future. Whereas being right on the coast is maybe not the place to be if you value your shoreline. I do know that that area has been considered for a while for a new protected area. And I don't know if it's actually been designated yet. Maybe it will be in the near future. The coast itself not being developed is definitely great for the folks who already live there, because the more hard development you have, the less ability you have to buffer the effects of those awful storms. But there just isn't a wetland in that area to protect people. That's what I meant.
This presentation was great. I don't know a lot about wetlands, but I learned a lot here today. I'm before this presentation, I like know wetlands like by the ocean or like the river and stuff like that. So I was wondering, like, what are steps individual right now, if we're not living by a wetland, can take to create more awareness about wetlands?
Yeah, I mean, go out and explore them for yourself and bring your family. We all have family that, don't like our natural history walks because we're slow or we talk too much. But bring them out, show them your favorite wetland and tell them about them. I mean, that's the best way to do that kind of outreach is through personal connection, at the back of trucks. And sometimes losing your boot in a bog is the best way to really appreciate what a bog does.
Cool. Thank you, Becky. So folks, if you don't have any question, then we will leave it there for now. But if you have any more questions, we will definitely make sure you get Becky's email. And if you're not following Nature Nova Scotia, definitely do and check out our website. We will be back in exactly a month, the first Tuesday of next month, which is March. And we will be changing gear a bit and moving into some bird-friendly Halifax topics. It will be it's going to be great. So please tune in. Thank you so much, Becky, for being with us tonight. Great presentation. And I learned so much about wetlands.
Thank you for organizing, Unity.
Thank you, folks, for tuning in tonight. We will let you go. Have a good night.
Night.